The auction house stood as a forgotten relic of time, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of years. Dimly lit chandeliers flickered, casting long, haunting shadows across the room. A thick, suffocating scent of dust, sweat, and desperation lingered in the air, mingling with the pungent aroma of unkempt animals packed into rusted cages. The crowd, a mix of wealthy collectors and opportunistic buyers, murmured among themselves, their eyes scanning the room for something valuable, something worth fighting over. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice worn from years of shouting bids, called out the details of each animal with a forced enthusiasm, trying to extract every last coin from the audience. One by one, exotic creatures were brought forward. A pair of rare parrots squawked in protest as they were displayed, their iridescent feathers shimmering under the dim light. They sold quickly. A magnificent white tiger, lean but still majestic, earned a fierce bidding war before being dragged away by its new owner. Every animal had a price, every sale a cold transaction, an exchange of ownership that held no regard for the lives being traded. Yet in the farthest corner of the auction house, hidden behind a stack of empty crates, sat an animal that no one paid attention to, a bear. At first glance, he didn't even look like a bear. His body was frail, his ribs protruding under a patchy, matted coat. His eyes, dull and lifeless, held no defiance, no fear, just an eerie resignation to whatever fate awaited him. Unlike the other animals who snarled, screeched, or whimpered, he made no sound, barely moving within the confines of his rusted cage. Flies buzzed around him, the scent of unwashed fur and neglect seeping into the wooden floor beneath him. He had been here too long, rejected at past auctions, passed over time and time again. His price had dropped so low that the auctioneer barely saw the point in trying to sell him. Next up, this bear, the auctioneer said with a sigh, waving a hand toward the cage without much effort. He didn't bother listing its breed, its background, or anything that might make it appealing to the bidders. It was clear that even he had given up on finding someone willing to take this pitiful creature home. Starting bid at $50, he announced, barely looking at the audience. Silence filled the room. The murmurs of the crowd hushed momentarily, but not in anticipation, rather in disinterest. A few buyers exchanged looks, some chuckling, others shaking their heads. This bear wasn't worth the trouble. He wasn't strong enough for fights, nor was he exotic enough to be a showpiece. He was sickly, weak, and more than likely would die within weeks. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $50, he repeated, this time with a hint of impatience. Anyone? A heavy silence followed. Someone scoffed in the back, muttering something about the bear being better off put down. Another bidder, dressed in a fine suit, laughed under his breath and turned his attention to the next animal's listing in the auction book, already dismissing this round. The bear remained still, his head resting on his frail paws, as if he had long accepted that no one wanted him. The auctioneer glanced around the room, his fingers tapping against the podium. "All right, we'll drop it to 30, he said with a shrug. $30 for the bear. Still, no hands went up. The atmosphere turned awkward. The auction house had never struggled this hard to sell an animal. It was embarrassing, even for an event that thrived on unethical trades. And then, a voice cut through the silence. "I'll take him." Heads turned. The auctioneer, surprised, peered into the audience to find the source of the voice. Standing near the side of the room was a young man, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the bear. He couldn't have been older than his early 20s, dressed simply in a worn-out jacket and faded jeans. Unlike the others in the room, he wasn't here to flaunt wealth, nor did he seem like a collector. He was just there. And yet he had spoken with certainty, his words carrying no hesitation. The auctioneer blinked, as if making sure he had heard correctly. "You want the bear?" he asked, as if needing confirmation. The young man nodded. "Yes." The room murmured in amusement. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "What a waste of money," someone whispered. "That thing won't last a week." Another scoffed, probably a bleeding heart thinking he can save it. The auctioneer, who had expected to simply mark the bear as unsold and move on, now found himself scrambling to regain his composure. Well, he stammered. "I suppose, sold." He slammed the gavel down. $30 to the young man in the back. The transaction was completed swiftly. No one else wanted to bid against him, and no one cared enough to question his decision. The auction house workers moved toward the cage with a mix of indifference and mild irritation. One of them yanked the rusted door open, his movements careless, as if already expecting the bear to collapse and die before it even made it out of the building. The young man, however, stepped forward with a quiet determination. The bear did not move. For a brief moment, it seemed as though it hadn't even registered what had happened. The only indication of life was the slow rise and fall of its chest. The young man crouched near the cage, getting a better look at the creature he had just bought. His expression was unreadable, but there was no disgust, no pity, just quiet understanding. As he reached out a cautious hand, the bear finally stirred just slightly. It was not fear nor aggression. It was something far more heartbreaking. The bear did not flinch, did not snarl. Instead, it looked up at him with eyes so void of hope, so resigned to fate, that it made the young man's throat tighten. "I've got you now," he murmured, as if making a promise only the bear could hear. And for the first time, in a place where he had only ever been invisible, the bear was noticed. The auction house workers barely put in the effort to handle the bear gently. They rattled the rusted cage door open, stepping back as if expecting the animal to lunge or cause trouble. But the bear did neither. He remained still, unmoving, except for the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. The young man, Alex, stepped forward, ignoring the murmurs of amusement and disbelief from the crowd behind him. He didn't care what they thought. He had seen something in the bear, something no one else had bothered to look for. "Come on, buddy," Alex whispered as he reached out a steady hand. He knew better than to force the bear out, especially one in such poor condition. He let his hand hover just inside the cage, giving the animal a choice, to acknowledge him or stay frozen in fear. For a moment, the bear didn't react. The seconds stretched on, thick with tension, until finally a small movement. The bear's nose twitched slightly, as if he were registering Alex's scent. He let out a slow, labored breath, then shifted his weight just enough to glance at the open cage door. His hesitation was clear. He had spent so long confined that the idea of leaving, even when given the chance, seemed foreign to him. One of the auction workers sighed. "You're wasting your time, kid. That thing's got nothing left in it." Alex ignored him. "You're free now," he said softly, keeping his voice steady. "Let's get you out of here." Slowly, ever so slowly, the bear moved. His frail legs trembled as he took an unsteady step forward. It was clear that he had not walked properly in a long time. The moment his paws touched the cold floor outside the cage, he hesitated again, as if uncertain of what would come next. "That's it," Alex encouraged, stepping back to give him space. With painful slowness, the bear took another step, and then another, until he was fully outside the cage. The auction workers muttered among themselves before quickly moving on into the next sale, already dismissing the spectacle as unimportant. The crowd, having lost interest, turned away, returning their focus to the next animal up for bidding. Alex crouched slightly to meet the bear's gaze. The animal's eyes, still dull and sunken, held no fear, but they also held no trust, just exhaustion. "You need a name," Alex murmured, glancing at the bear's frail frame. He had once read about a bear named Coda in a childhood book, a strong and noble creature. Looking at this bear, who was nothing more than a ghost of what he should have been, the name felt like an ironic but fitting choice. "How about Coda?" The bear didn't react, but Alex decided it was settled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread he had taken from the meal he ate earlier that day. It was dry and not much, but he held it out anyway. "Here, try this," he said. Coda barely glanced at it. Instead, he lowered his head, letting out a soft, almost inaudible breath. Alex's heart clenched. The bear wasn't just starving, he had given up. He didn't even have the will to accept food anymore. Alex exhaled, steadying himself. He had known from the moment he raised his hand at the auction that this wasn't going to be easy. "One step at a time," he murmured, more to himself than to Coda. With quiet patience, he led the bear toward the exit of the auction house. The night air hit them as they stepped outside, cold and sharp against their skin and fur. Coda shivered slightly, unused to the sensation of open space. Alex took off his worn-out jacket. placing it gently over the bear's back. "You're safe now," he said firmly. Coda didn't react. He simply stood there, breathing in the unfamiliar scent of freedom. And just like that, the journey began. The road home was long and quiet, with only the sound of Alex's steady footsteps and Coda's uneven breathing filling the night air. The bear moved slowly, his legs weak from prolonged confinement, each step appearing more exhausting than the last. Every few minutes, Alex glanced back to make sure Coda was still following. His heart ached at the sight. This was not the powerful, majestic creature that bears were meant to be. Coda looked like a ghost of himself, a shadow of what he should have been. Alex had brought his old pickup truck, parked a short distance from the auction house. He had assumed he would have to coax Coda into it, but to his surprise, the bear barely hesitated when the door opened. He didn't resist, didn't growl. He just climbed in sluggishly, curling up on the tattered blanket Alex had placed for him in the truck bed. No fear, no fight, just exhaustion. The drive home was filled with quiet thoughts. Alex had no grand plan, no idea how to properly care for a bear. But he knew one thing: he couldn't let Coda die. He had spent his childhood around animals, helping out at his uncle's farm. But this was different. This wasn't a domesticated pet or livestock. This was a bear, a creature meant to roam wild and free. When they finally arrived at Alex's cabin, deep in the outskirts of a small rural town, Coda barely stirred. The old wooden house wasn't much, just a modest space Alex had inherited from his grandfather. But it was home. Surrounding it was a large, fenced-off section of land, which Alex had originally used for growing vegetables and keeping a few stray dogs he had taken in over the years. "Coda," Alex said gently, giving the bear a soft nudge. Coda lifted his head slightly but didn't move otherwise. His breathing was slow and deep, as though the truck bed was the safest place he had ever been. Alex sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "All right, buddy, let's get you inside." It took a bit of coaxing, but eventually Coda managed to stumble out of the truck. He moved like an old man, his joints stiff and aching with every step. Alex led him to the covered porch, where he had already prepared a space: a large dog bed, a bucket of fresh water, and a small bowl of mashed up fruit and vegetables. He wasn't sure what Coda would eat. He had read that bears in the wild consumed a mix of berries, plants, fish, and small mammals. But this bear, this broken, forgotten bear, looked like he hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Alex sat beside him, watching carefully as Coda sniffed at the bowl. For a moment, hope flickered in Alex's chest, but then the bear simply lowered his head and turned away. "You've got to eat," Alex murmured, pushing the bowl slightly closer. "Just a little bit." Coda ignored it. Alex exhaled slowly. He could see it in the bear's eyes. He wasn't just physically weak. He was broken inside. He had been passed around, rejected, locked in cages for so long that he didn't know what it meant to be cared for. "This is going to take time, isn't it?" Alex muttered, more to himself than to Coda. As the night deepened, Alex covered the bear with an old blanket and sat with him for a long time. He could hear the wind howling through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. But inside his porch, there was only the sound of Coda's slow, steady breathing. Tomorrow he would try again. Tomorrow he would make sure Coda found a reason to keep going. The next morning, Alex woke up early, stretching his stiff limbs after having dozed off on the porch beside Coda. The bear hadn't moved much throughout the night, remaining curled up under the old blanket. His slow, shallow breathing made Alex uneasy. He knew that if Coda refused to eat, his condition would only worsen. Determined, Alex went back inside and rummaged through his supplies. He chopped up fresh apples and bananas, mixed them with honey, and placed the bowl in front of Coda once more. "Come on, buddy," he coaxed, setting the food down gently. Coda barely acknowledged it. His dull, lifeless eyes remained fixed on the wooden floorboards of the porch. He had spent so long being neglected that even basic survival instincts seemed weakened. Alex let out a slow breath, his mind racing for another idea. If Coda didn't eat soon, his body would deteriorate even further. With a quiet determination, Alex took a piece of banana, mashed it with honey, and carefully reached out his hand. He knew this was risky. Bears, no matter how weak, could still be unpredictable. But something told him Coda wouldn't attack. The bear flinched slightly as Alex's hand hovered near his nose. but he didn't pull away completely. Instead, he sniffed the offering, his dry nostrils flaring slightly. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. And then, to Alex's relief, Koda's tongue flicked out, hesitantly tasting the fruit. "That's it," Alex whispered encouragingly. Slowly, Koda licked the rest of the mashed banana from Alex's palm. It wasn't much, but it was something. Encouraged, Alex tried again, this time placing a small apple slice near the bear's mouth. Koda hesitated but eventually took the fruit, chewing it weakly. It was clear that eating was an effort for him, but he was trying, and that was enough for Alex. Over the next few days, their routine continued. Alex remained patient, offering food by hand when Koda refused to eat from the bowl. Little by little, the bear began to take small bites, his appetite returning ever so slightly. His movements were slow, his energy levels low, but for the first time, there was a flicker of life in his eyes. One evening, as Alex sat beside Koda, watching the sun dip below the horizon, something unexpected happened. The bear, who had remained distant and unresponsive for days, nudged Alex's knee with his snout. Alex froze. It was the first time Koda had initiated any kind of contact. A lump formed in Alex's throat as he reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingers against Koda's coarse fur. The bear didn't flinch away this time. Instead, he let out a slow exhale, almost as if he were finally allowing himself to accept the kindness being offered to him. "You're getting there, buddy," Alex murmured. "We both are." That night, as Alex watched Koda rest more peacefully than before, he knew that their bond, though fragile, was beginning to take shape. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, Koda grew stronger. His fur, once dull and patchy, slowly thickened. His ribs, once painfully visible, now had a soft layer of muscle covering them. He still moved cautiously, his energy limited, but there was a noticeable difference. His eyes no longer looked empty. Alex kept a close routine, feeding Koda small meals throughout the day, ensuring he got enough nutrients without overwhelming his fragile digestive system. He mixed fruits with oats and drizzled honey over them, experimenting with different foods to see what Koda would respond to best. He also introduced fish, cooking it lightly to make it easier for the bear to digest. At first, Koda remained indifferent, but one evening, something shifted. As Alex filleted a freshly caught fish by the river, Koda's nose twitched. His ears perked up slightly, and for the first time, his instincts seemed to awaken. Without hesitation, he took a cautious step toward Alex, his gaze locked onto the fish. Alex, realizing the moment was important, stayed still, waiting. Koda let out a low rumble, neither aggressive nor fearful. It was anticipation. "You want this, don't you?" Alex murmured, holding out the fish. Koda sniffed it, then took the fillet gently from Alex's hand. He chewed slowly, as if savoring the taste. It was a small thing, but to Alex, it felt like a massive breakthrough. Koda was beginning to trust him, not just as a source of food, but as something more. One afternoon, as Alex worked on fixing a section of his porch railing, he glanced over and noticed Koda doing something unusual. The bear, now much steadier on his feet, had found an old deflated ball in the yard. At first, he simply stared at it, tilting his head slightly. Then, in an unexpected moment of curiosity, he nudged it with his nose. Alex put down his tools, watching with quiet amazement. Koda pushed the ball again, this time harder, causing it to roll a short distance. He paused, looking at it, then nudged it once more. A small, almost playful movement. A smile tugged at Alex's lips. He walked over, picked up the ball, and rolled it back toward Koda. The bear hesitated, but then batted at it with one paw, sending it wobbling across the dirt. "Would you look at that?" Alex muttered under his breath. It was the first time he had seen Koda show any sign of playfulness. The sight of a once broken, abandoned bear, rediscovering something as simple as curiosity, stirred something deep in Alex's chest. As the weeks stretched into months, Koda's movements became more fluid, his strength returning. He started following Alex around the property, watching as he worked on various tasks. He was still cautious, still hesitant in some ways, but there was no doubt. He was no longer the same lifeless creature Alex had brought home from the auction. The neighbors who had initially mocked Alex's decision to take in the bear began to take notice. Some stopped by, watching from a distance as Coda wandered freely around the property, moving with a newfound sense of confidence. "Didn't think he'd last a week," one of the older men in town admitted, "but I'll be damned if that ain't the healthiest looking bear I've ever seen now." Alex just nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, Coda walked over and, for the first time, leaned against Alex's side. The warmth of the bear's body pressed against him, solid and real. Alex reached up and ran his fingers through Coda's fur, feeling the strength beneath it. "You're not that helpless, rejected bear anymore, are you?" he murmured. Coda let out a deep, contented breath. For the first time since that fateful night at the auction, Alex knew. Coda wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. As Coda grew stronger, Alex became more curious about his past. Where had he come from? How had he ended up in that auction house, weak and unwanted? He knew that animals like Coda weren't born into those conditions. They were made to suffer through them. The more he looked at the scars on Coda's body, the more he realized there was a darker story behind them. One evening, after securing the fencing around his property, Alex sat on the porch with his laptop, searching for information on illegal animal auctions. He sifted through old news articles, rescue reports, and online forums. The stories he found were gut-wrenching. Many of these auctions were used to sell animals that had been stolen from the wild, bred in captivity under horrific conditions, or discarded from illegal entertainment rings. His hands clenched into fists as he read about bears being chained up, forced to perform tricks for tourists, or used in underground fighting rings where they were pitted against each other for gambling profits. The scars on Coda's body suddenly made more sense. Determined, Alex dug deeper, checking old records from the auction house. After hours of research, he finally found something, an old listing of animals from previous auctions. His eyes scanned the screen until they landed on a small, blurry photograph of Coda. The file attached to it was chilling. Coda had been bred in captivity and taken from his mother as a cub. He had been sold multiple times, passed from one cruel owner to another, each one treating him worse than the last. He had been starved, beaten, and eventually deemed worthless after refusing to participate in forced performances. When he became too weak and fearful, his owners had discarded him, sending him to the auction house as a last-ditch effort to make money off of him. Alex felt sick. He turned to where Coda was lying near the steps, curled up peacefully. The thought of this gentle bear being mistreated so horribly made his chest tighten with anger. "You never had a chance, did you?" Alex whispered. Coda's past was filled with cruelty, but now things were different. He was safe, he was healing, and Alex was going to make sure no one ever hurt him again. From that moment on, Alex made a promise to not only protect Coda, but to do everything he could to prevent other animals from suffering the same fate. The past had tried to break Coda, but Alex was determined that it would never define him. Days turned into weeks, and Coda continued to change. His movements became more confident, his curiosity growing. He no longer hesitated to explore the land, no longer flinched when Alex reached out to touch him. The fearful, broken creature Alex had rescued was slowly transforming into the bear he was always meant to be. One evening, as Alex sat on the porch drinking a cup of tea, Coda approached him with an unexpected sense of purpose. The bear, now much stronger, stood before him, staring at him with deep, searching eyes. "What is it, buddy?" Alex asked, lowering his mug. Coda stepped closer, his massive frame now towering over Alex. But instead of fear, there was something else: trust. Slowly, Coda nudged his large head against Alex's shoulder. Alex's breath caught. It was the first time Coda had sought comfort from him on his own. A lump formed in his throat as he reached up, hesitantly resting a hand against the bear's fur. He expected Coda to pull away, but instead, the bear leaned into the touch. "You really are something special," Alex murmured. From that day forward, everything changed. Coda no longer hesitated when Alex called his name. He followed him around the property, watching him work. He even sat near the porch in the evenings, as if keeping Alex company. Then one day, something happened that solidified their bond forever. Alex had been fixing a section of the fence when he suddenly lost his balance, tumbling backward onto the ground. A sharp pain shot through his ankle, and he winced, realizing he had twisted it badly. He tried to stand but failed, groaning in frustration. Kota, who had been watching from a distance, immediately reacted. He lumbered over to Alex, his head tilting in curiosity, before he let out a soft, concerned rumble. "I'm fine," Alex gritted out. "Just need a minute." But Kota didn't leave. Instead, he did something that stunned Alex. He gently lowered his massive body beside him, staying close, as if refusing to leave him unprotected. For the first time in his life, Kota wasn't the one who needed saving. He had become the protector. The night sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the wind howled through the trees like a restless spirit. Rain pelted the ground in heavy sheets, turning the dirt into thick mud. Alex had been meaning to reinforce the northern section of the fence for weeks, but the storm had come sooner than expected. The old wooden posts were weak, some barely standing, and the wind threatened to bring them down entirely. Despite the downpour, Alex worked with urgency, hammering new support beams into place. His hands were numb from the cold, his soaked clothes clinging uncomfortably to his skin. Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating the landscape for a brief second. Kota watched from a few feet away, his large body barely flinching at the thunder. Over time, he had become accustomed to the sounds of nature's fury, but he still remained alert, keeping an eye on Alex. Alex struck a final nail into the wood, gripping the post to make sure it was secure. But just as he turned to move, his boot slipped in the thick mud. He lost his balance and fell hard, his ankle twisting painfully beneath him. A sharp, searing pain shot up his leg, and he let out a strangled groan. Gritting his teeth, he tried to move, but the moment he put weight on his injured ankle, his body crumpled back to the ground. He cursed under his breath. The storm was getting worse, and he was a good distance from the cabin. He needed to get back, needed to get out of the rain before hypothermia set in. Kota, sensing something was wrong, moved closer. He lowered his head, his nose twitching as he took in Alex's scent. A deep, concerned rumble vibrated in his chest. "I'm fine, buddy," Alex grunted, though he knew it was a lie. He braced himself and tried once more to push up from the ground. His ankle throbbed mercilessly, refusing to hold his weight. He collapsed again, mud splattering against his arms. Kota huffed loudly, circling him with restless energy. It was clear he understood that Alex was in trouble. The wind roared, shaking the trees. Another crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening boom of thunder. The storm wasn't letting up, and Alex's body was quickly losing heat. His cabin wasn't far, but in his current condition, it might as well have been miles away. "Come on, think," Alex muttered to himself. He needed a plan, something to get him back before the cold overtook him. But before he could formulate a solution, Kota made a decision that left him stunned. The bear, without hesitation, stepped forward and crouched beside Alex. At first, Alex didn't understand what he was doing, but then he noticed how Kota had positioned himself, his broad back angled in such a way that suggested he wanted Alex to lean on him. "You've got to be kidding me," Alex breathed. Kota let out a soft huff, nudging Alex gently with his snout. The message was clear: "I'll carry you." Alex hesitated. He had always known Kota was smart, but this was something else entirely. Could he really lean on the bear like this? Would Kota even be able to support his weight properly? Another gust of wind made the decision for him. Shivering violently, Alex reached out and placed a shaky hand on Kota's back. He braced himself, then slowly pulled himself up, using Kota's massive body as support. To his amazement, Kota didn't budge. The bear remained steady, waiting for Alex to settle. "All right, big guy," Alex murmured. "Let's get home." Kota began moving carefully, adjusting his steps to match Alex's unsteady pace. Each step felt surreal. Alex was literally leaning on a bear for survival. He had saved Kota once, and now Kota was returning the favor. The rain continued to pour, the storm unrelenting. But despite the treacherous conditions, Kota never faltered. He guided Alex across the muddy ground, step by step, until the cabin finally came into view. With one last push, Kota helped Alex reach the porch. The moment Alex collapsed onto the wooden steps, exhaustion taking over, Kota sat beside him, keeping watch. Alex let out a breathless chuckle. "Didn't think I'd be getting a ride from a bear tonight." Kota huffed in response, his warm breath fogging the cold air. Alex reached out and patted his thick fur. "You saved me, buddy." And in that moment, there was no doubt. Kota wasn't just a bear anymore. He was family. Alex's body ached with exhaustion as he leaned against Kota, his ankle throbbing with sharp, unrelenting pain. The cold rain soaked through his clothes, his fingers stiff as he clung to Kota's thick fur for support. Every step forward was a struggle, his muscles screaming for rest. But Kota remained steady, adjusting his pace to match Alex's slow, stumbling movements. Despite the storm, despite the mud sucking at their feet, the bear moved with an unshakable determination, as if he understood that Alex's survival depended on him. The wind howled through the trees, the storm refusing to let up. Alex's breaths came in ragged gasps, his strength fading fast. His cabin was close. He could see the outline of the porch through the sheets of rain, but the journey felt endless. His ankle burned with each attempt to move, and his body was growing weaker by the second. He clenched his jaw, willing himself to push forward, but his limbs no longer obeyed him. Then, just a few feet from the porch, his legs buckled, his vision blurred, and before he could catch himself, he collapsed into the mud. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled and gave out beneath him. The cold seeped deep into his bones, numbing him. His breast became shallow, his body ready to surrender. But Kota refused to let that happen. The bear let out a deep, urgent rumble, nudging Alex's body with his nose. When Alex didn't respond, Kota let out another sound. Louder this time, a desperate, guttural call that echoed through the storm. His instincts took over. He pawed at the ground around Alex, nudging him again, trying to keep him conscious. Then he did something that stunned even Alex in his weakened state. Kota threw back his massive head and let out a deafening, primal roar. It was a sound that cut through the storm, raw and commanding, unlike anything Alex had ever heard from him before. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't fear, it was a call for help. The sound carried across the valley, reaching the ears of those who lived nearby. The neighbors, who had long been skeptical of Alex's decision to take in the bear, heard the haunting roar and stopped in their tracks. Some rushed to their windows, their curiosity turning to concern. Others, recognizing the urgency in the bear's voice, grabbed their coats and flashlights, braving the storm to see what had happened. It wasn't long before beams of light cut through the darkness, approaching from the distance. The voices of Alex's neighbors called out through the rain, but Kota didn't move from his position. He remained by Alex's side, his massive body a protective barrier against the elements. His deep breaths were steady, his muscles tense as he watched the approaching figures. When the first neighbor arrived, he froze at the sight before him. There, lying in the mud, was Alex, pale, shivering, barely conscious. And beside him, Kota stood guard, his golden brown fur drenched from the rain, his dark eyes locked onto the strangers with an unmistakable message: help him. More neighbors arrived, and murmurs of disbelief rippled through the group. Many of them had laughed at Alex for taking in the weak, rejected bear from the auction. They had assumed Kota would never survive, let alone form any kind of bond with his rescuer. But now in front of their eyes stood a bear who had done the impossible. He had saved the very man who had saved him. One of the older men shook his head in awe. "I don't believe it," he muttered. "That bear, he knew Alex was in trouble." "Not just that," another whispered. "He called for help." The group wasted no time. They helped Alex onto a makeshift stretcher and carried him toward the cabin. But Kota refused to be left behind. He followed closely, his eyes never leaving Alex. Even when they reached the cabin and laid Alex down inside by the fireplace, Kota remained at the doorstep, his large frame blocking the entrance as if daring anyone to take his human away from him. As Alex slowly regained his senses, he turned his head to the doorway. Through the haze of his exhaustion, he saw Kota sitting there, unwavering and protective. His heart clenched at the sight. You really saved me, didn't you?" Alex murmured weakly. Kota let out a low, soft huff in response, settling down beside the doorway, his watchful eyes never straying from Alex. The neighbors stood in silence watching the scene unfold. Many had believed that Kota was just an unwanted, broken bear, a creature that should have been left to die in that auction house. But now they saw the truth. Kota was more than just a rescued animal. He was a loyal companion, a protector, and a living testament to the power of kindness and second chances. And on that stormy night, he had proven it to everyone. The days that followed were filled with quiet recovery. Alex rested in his cabin, his ankle wrapped tightly, the pain still a dull ache but manageable. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear sky and fresh, crisp air. But more than the weather had changed, something in the town had shifted. Word of Koda's actions spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once doubted Alex's decision to save the bear now spoke of him in admiration. Stories of how Koda had stayed by Alex's side, refusing to leave him in the storm, were repeated over and over. The once rejected, forgotten bear had become a legend in their small community. People who had mocked Alex before now came to see Koda with their own eyes, their skepticism replaced with awe. As Alex sat on his porch, stretching his sore leg, he watched Koda resting nearby. The bear had grown into his strength, his coat thick and healthy, his eyes no longer hollow and lifeless. He was no longer just a discarded animal. He was a symbol of resilience. "You really proved them all wrong, huh?" Alex murmured with a smile. Koda, hearing his voice, lifted his head and let out a soft huff, almost as if he understood. But Alex knew their journey wasn't over. He had saved Koda from an auction house where animals were treated as disposable goods, and he couldn't ignore the thought of how many others were still suffering in those conditions. Determined, Alex began making calls, reaching out to animal protection groups and local officials. He shared Koda's story, using it as proof of why these cruel auctions needed to be shut down. At first, many dismissed him. After all, he was just a regular guy with a bear. But as the story gained traction, media outlets started paying attention. Pictures of Koda standing protectively by Alex's side spread online, drawing sympathy and outrage. The pressure grew, and soon real discussions about banning illegal animal auctions started taking place. One afternoon, a reporter visited Alex's cabin, wanting to capture the story firsthand. As the cameras rolled, Alex stood beside Koda, running a hand over the bear's thick fur. "They called him worthless," he said, his voice steady. "They thought he wouldn't make it. But look at him now. He's not just surviving, he's thriving. Every animal deserves that chance." The interview went viral. People from across the country sent messages of support, asking how they could help. Rescue organizations offered to assist in shutting down illegal auctions, and petitions were signed by the thousands. Through it all, Koda remained by Alex's side. No longer the frail, forgotten creature in a rusted cage, he stood tall, his presence powerful yet gentle. He had been given a second chance, and in return, he had saved the man who had saved him. As Alex ran a hand over Koda's back, he smiled. "We've come a long way, buddy." Koda let out a slow, contented breath. Their story had started with pain and rejection, but it had become something greater, a testament to the power of kindness, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. And this was only the beginning. If you believe in the power of second chances and want to hear more incredible stories like Koda's, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey of hope, love, and resilience.